I think we turned what is often an existential crisis of meaning into a sickness. Well, you can't heal an existential crisis by saying you're sick, because you're not sick.
All right, welcome to Cwic Show. I am your host, Greg Mattson. I am with LDS therapist and blogger, writer, Jeff Bennion. And we are going to be talking about the LDS Church in therapy. A week or two ago, we had the disciplinary council for Natasha Helfer. And this really brought to light a lot of things about the at least a perceived conflict between therapy and the LDS Church and its doctrine. And I think Natasha Helfer represents one side of this conflict, and I think that Jeff probably represents another side of this. So what I want to do in talking with Jeff here and bringing him onto the show is get his perspective on this. What are the conflicts? Where might this be going? And I mean, Jeff, we live in much more of a therapeutic world these days, right? I mean, I guess that's good for you and your business, but it's, that's therapy is a big deal. I mean, I hear it all the time. Everybody should be in therapy. Everybody should go to a therapist. Isn't that right?
I can't necessarily argue with that. I think everybody would benefit from therapy. I don't know that everybody needs to do it. And on the other hand, some people have been to too much therapy.
Okay.
I'm probably, again, in the minority in my profession in saying that, but I'll stand by it.
Okay. So I want to bring up, and I want to use a little bit about what Natasha Helfer had said. For those of you who may not have seen the previous episode or don't know who she is, she had a disciplinary council. She was excommunicated. She came out and said that because she was in conflict with LDS Church doctrine. And she was very publicly, going out and talking about how, basically preaching against church doctrine and perhaps influencing people against church doctrine. But here's something that she said. I want to go through a few of these points and you tell me what you think about these and where therapy stands in terms of LDS members of the church who are in therapy, may want to go to therapy in the future, and what their trust level can be. I know there's a lot of really good LDS therapists out there, but she brings up a couple of points. One here is, she says, in starting out, first of all, she says that the reason I'm being called to such a meeting, being her disciplinary council, all have to do with the fact that I am a mental health professional and certified sex therapist. And I am public and vocal about my stances, supporting and educating about sexual health, which it seems they, being the church, do not see as within compliance within their doctrine. Where is this right now? I mean, this brings up something I hadn't even thought about. I mean, obviously there's always the conflict between Jerusalem and Alexandria, right? There's always the conflict between academia and theology and church, right?
Babylon and Zion.
Exactly. So
about it, yes.
What does this mean? What is she saying here?
Well, here's what might surprise you. I'm not sure that she's wrong about that.
Okay.
In other words, I look at the state of my profession, and I look at, its worldview, and it is in conflict with religion to a substantial degree. Now, that's not to say all therapists are on board with what Natasha is saying here, but to give her credit, she's articulating the mainstream view. And the view you're going to hear from me tonight is definitely, I think it's defensible empirically, scientifically, and religiously, but it is not the majority view. I am not in the mainstream as a therapist. And, maybe it's always been historical. You go back to Sigmund Freud, Wilhelm Wundt and some of these early psychology, the psychiatrists and psychologists that started the field in the late 1800s. And all of them, but William James, I think, were pretty much hostile entirely to religion. So, Freud saw it as this displaced father figure looking for the sky god was some displaced father, and there's this rebellion. You have to kill your father. Anyway, there was this whole thing about killing God, and so we got off on the wrong foot for sure.
Okay. So you're saying that the precedent originally in the field of psychology automatically has a Nietzschean component to it. It's just that it's not taking into consideration religion. It's not taking in a consideration of belief in really. Can I say a belief in morality to some degree, spiritual morality?
Yeah, I mean, maybe Freud would kind of rationalize the morality as a kind of a neurotic response to certain drives. So he wasn't himself, I wouldn't say, it would be unfair to say he was hostile to traditional morality, but he had certainly an anti-religious view of how it formed, and certainly some parts of that he saw as unhealthy. And the other interesting thing is he really talked a lot about eros. It's kind of a Freudian test how you define eros, actually. Some people say it's the life force. Some people say it's the sex drive. And maybe that tells you more about the person defining it, than it does Freud. But certainly the life force and the sexual drives are active, he believed, in humans from very young age. Now, I do also need to say, I'm being historical with Freud. We don't even cover Freud hardly at all in our graduate program. So probably all my colleagues are getting mad I'm bringing him up, because he's really more relevant in English literature programs than modern mental health.
Interesting.
But I think historically, like I say, we got off on the wrong foot.
So she says this about, and her argument was kind of, she wanted to make the conflict, right? She brings up the conflict, and that's her battle cry, right? That's her line in the sand, is saying, here's my profession, and here's the church over here. And there is a line in the sand, and she wants the church to change.
Exactly.
Right. And not the field to change. Her field to change. She says this: when a church which refuses to accept science, and this is any church, our church is included, and discredits the people that can most help that community, is the church's stance, if they hang tight to the law of chastity, are they discrediting members of your community?
Discrediting. You mean disavowing or disagreeing with?
Well, I don't know. I'm just repeating her words.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so you can kind of tell there, if we pick that apart, I mean, that is really a great quote to kind of dissect her worldview. And I don't want to pick on her, because like I say, she's representing the mainstream. And let me also say, I have no opinion on what her membership status should or shouldn't have been.
Nor do I.
All I would say is, it's not illegitimate to have disciplinary councils in principle. Is all I'd say. I think it's a legitimate and necessary function, and I'm going to leave it to the local leaders to make their decision. And I understand she's appealed it, so I'm perfectly happy to stay out of that. I don't have an opinion, and I don't care.
Yeah, and we're not going down that road at all. So,
but because again, I think she represents the dominant view especially in the sex therapy, the asect aligned, as I talk about in my article.
Okay, will you just say who that is? That's the organization.
Okay, that's the American Association of Sex Education Counselors, Therapists, and anyway, I can't remember the last.
I think that's it, actually.
Yeah.
Therapist, yeah.
So they, so she said something like science, the church will not accept science. And it's kind of my job to call that out and say it needs to be corrected. And let's take that word science. And there is a philosophy that I call scientism. I didn't coin that word. There's a lot of people, but some people disagree on what scientism means. So I'll define what I mean by that. Mm-hmm. In my view, scientism is a misplaced faith in the conclusions of science while neglecting the process of science. In my mind, so I totally believe and support science. I totally reject scientism. To me, it's an idol. It's a false god you worship. Science is a mode of inquiry.
So you're saying scientism is like a religion. You're putting it up at your highest level, right? It's what you believe.
Right. And scientism, in my opinion, is more about the mainstream consensus. It's more about the accepted wisdom of whatever the age is. So scientism would say, well, whatever the mainstream opinion is in whatever scientific field, that's science. Whereas I reject that, and I say science is a way to examine certain questions that are amenable to empirical answers. So how do people do better? What is are there more or less effective ways to treat unwanted pornography use, which is that's one of the controversies here. And whereas scientism would say, well, what's the dominant worldview there? What's the dominant opinion? Science would say, well, let's look at the studies. Let's look at that research. Were those studies well sampled? Were the statistical methods applied appropriately? Were the conclusions really powerful enough to really warrant, or is it being oversold? Is it generalizable? Let me teach you another acronym, WEIRD, WEIRD. A lot of research is on WEIRDs, Western, educated, industrialized, oh, brother, now I'm forgetting the
R?
I forgot the R, but the last one is developed. Anyway, This is the wealthy, modern worldview. This is Europe, especially Western Europe. It's the United States, it's Canada.
The privileged view.
Yes, exactly. And there's about 5 billion people in the rest of the world. And most of the research that we've done is on WEIRDs.
Interesting.
And it's a funny acronym because, we are the minority. So we are kind of the weird ones in the world right now. And so and then the other piece I wanted to tell you about is we are in the middle, in my field, we are in the middle of what's called a replication crisis. What that means is they have taken a bunch of scientists, and this is really odd. This is science, Greg, okay? They said, let's take some of these foundational studies and let's reproduce them. Let's reproduce them in India. Let's reproduce them here. Let's see if we get the same result. Greg, they can only do it half the time. And these aren't fringe studies. So it really gets my dander up when people, Natasha does this, but she is, this is everybody almost. There is a lack of humility, which bothers me in this and other scientific fields, because the replication crisis now is extending to other things than the behavioral sciences, but it started there. So there are some really, can we really say we know what we know? In other words, about half the studies you would read about in your introductory psychology class are wrong, or at least, I shouldn't say wrong, have not been proven.
But it's not as empirical as it's being represented.
Right. And that is what I call scientism. Yeah. Scientism says, look, we have this thing and it's unimpeachable. There's no way to dispute it. And I'm saying, wait a minute. Even well-sampled, famous studies have not been able to be reproduced. And the studies that, if we were to drill into this with people, a lot of the studies they use are not even, as well done as some of these studies you can't reproduce. So So I won't claim that I can demonstrate unequivocally my position, because particularly in the behavioral sciences, it's very difficult to do this research. Let me give you another example. Outcome research is really hard to do when you're talking about therapy. So outcome research says, all right, what kind of therapy is best to treat depression, right? This is the most common. Anxiety and depression are the two most common mental health complaints in this country. And so we're looking at, how well do people treat depression? Well, is a cognitive behavioral approach good? Is a dialectical behavioral approach good? Is a narrative approach good? Is an internal systems approach good? I mean, there's all these modalities that we learn. They're all supposedly empirically grounded, but it's actually really hard to say, okay, let's randomly assign some depressed people to these two categories. And then let's measure, well, one, is our measurement good? Everybody uses the Beck Depression Inventory, and it's probably a good one. So I don't quibble with that, but it's not always so easy in other fields. And then do we measure them at the beginning of the study? We measure them at the end. And what's the change? Well, you also need a control group of no treatment, because 50% of depression, major depression, will go into spontaneous remission within 12 months. So half of the people that have it actually get better without any therapy within 12 months. And so you've already got 50% you kind of just knock off, right? That you could just say. So the other differences are really hard to tease out. And then how do you make sure you're doing the exact same therapy, right? Is this clinician doing cognitive behavioral therapy the same way as this clinician is? And are all clinicians the same? Are we little cookie cutters that you can just... So it's hard to really do research, particularly on, this therapy is the best one. It's very hard to establish.
So again, I mean, just summarizing that, then the consensus. I mean, what you're basically you're shooting holes into the consensus in therapy, right? You're saying that we may not be, even though the consensus of maybe your field is against some of the church doctrine, that consensus may be incorrect.
Right.
So the truth there may not be actually a conflict there between the two. Rather, it's the scientism of the consensus that is causing the problem. This is this leads me to this. Because again, if that's the true, then that brings up several problems. I mean, here's one thing that you had stated in your article that you had written on this. You said, even in the empirical literature we refer to, what matters is what promotes mental health and well-being, which is immediately makes you think, okay, so how does that determine, for example, the goal? How does that determine the questions that you're asking, right, with a client, et cetera? I'll get to that in a minute. As we ourselves define it, if truth or even someone else advocating, you continue, for their understanding of truth impinges on someone's mental health, it is bad and wrong and needs to stop. So here's one of the big things I really wanted to get out of this interview here is, what would the consensus in your field then be exactly that? What matters is the short term, because I think you have to define that. You have to say, is it the short-term well-being and emotional health today and this week until I meet with this client again next week, the most important thing? Or is it, how do I help this client improve and progress by having to work through hard things?
Yes, you're getting to something even more foundational, Greg, than the empirical questions, because the practice of science doesn't happen in a vacuum. It isn't like we're these detached, totally objective people formulating these hypotheses and then we test through science. And you've hit on a really fundamental one, which is, what is the good life? This question goes back to Aristotle, Plato, not to mention, the Old Testament, all the way to Adam and Eve, we could say, as Latter-day Saints, right? So what for, and this, I called therapists narcissists in my,
I saw that.
and I it was
Self-deprecating. It's appealing. It's all right.
it was a strong word, but here's what I mean. It elaborates on this point. So we deal with the individual or the family, or social workers will sometimes deal with a community, but we don't deal with norms. What are norms? We therapists never think about how norms are established and maintained and why they are important.
You're talking about social norms?
For example, yes, right. And even think of one that's not controversial, right? You go to a store, you buy some frozen yogurt, and the guy says, sorry, I'm not giving you your yogurt. And I'm not giving you your money back either. We have a norm that's established there. I give you money at a set price and you give me a good and service. What would happen if that norm broke down? The problem is we therapists don't care about norms. And to be fair, it's not our job, right? We're sitting with an individual, but we call them norms, not universals, right? And so by the very name, there are people who fall outside the norms. And we therapists are caring, we're in the caring profession. So we care about those people that fall outside the norms. And so we'll often say, oh my gosh, these norms are hurting. You imagine the bell curve. The norms are hurting these people. We need to get rid of the norms. And sometimes maybe those norms need to go. I'm not saying we're always wrong about that, but in our narcissism, in our caring, well-intentioned narcissism, we look at these people that fall outside of the norms, we feel bad for them, and we want to reorder society to do that. And so we'll look at things like, people, that are, have, non-conventional sexual proclivities. We need to embrace them and normalize that and do that. And we don't even, and then we tie it to your idea, which is well-being. What is healthy, right? You'll often hear sex therapists talk about healthy behaviors. And there's healthy ways to engage in them and there's unhealthy ways to engage in them. But their definitions of well-being, happiness, healthy, have very little to do with the way a traditional religious view would have. Or even if you go back to Aristotle would take issue with his, Aristotle's idea of happiness was really a life well lived. Whereas we talk about it, the term in our field is called eudaimonia or eudaimonic happiness. And it means feeling good, right? And Aristotle, that was Aristotle's, sorry, I'm mixing them up. We would call that hedonic. And then there's eudaimonic. And eudaimonic is that well-being, that living well kind of idea. And this is more congruent. When we say, when Lehi says men are that they might have joy, what does he mean? And if you take a modern therapeutic view of that word, joy equals feeling good about yourself and your life. Sometimes the commandments aren't going to keeping the commandments aren't going to lead to that. And yet that idea, you can even graft it onto religion. And it's the idea that our goal in therapy is to help people feel secure and content. And anything that challenges us or makes us feel uncomfortable or unhappy could be seen as detrimental to mental health. And if you graft, and so that's the therapeutic way, but there are a lot of therapists who graft this idea onto God, right? God would never want me to be unhappy. And God created me to be happy. See, it's in the scriptures right there in 2nd Nephi. And so we call that therapeutic deism, where God is basically, talk about narcissism, a therapist in the sky that is just, God's never going to ask hard things of us. He's never going to ask us to be an outcast or on the outside or out of the mainstream. He just wants us to be happy. He just wants us to be well adjusted.
Well,
I would
that
argue,
seems to me, just let me interject, that seems to me to be where he is evolving to based on our society, right?
Mhm.
As I heard earlier yesterday, a term where he's the teddy bear Jesus, right?
Yes,
And,
yes.
and it's like, well, and I get this all the time when I put this episode on Natasha out there last week. That's what came up in the comments a lot, also, right? It's a matter of, it's a non-judgmental God. He's not going to, of course, he's going to tolerate everything because he's compassionate,
Mhm.
right? And so the issue there is if because you bring up another point there, if the goal almost seems like the same thing between the religion and therapy, right? It's well-being, it's happiness, right? But it's just the
Ultimately.
interpretation of what that is.
Mhm. Well, it's ultimate versus proximate happiness, I would say, right? Like, I had a pioneer ancestor who was well-to-do, uh, and she was a good Methodist family. I don't remember if she was Methodist or not, but she was well-to-do, a good person. And, she comes across the plains and gives up everything. Husband dies on the plains. She loses kids in childbirth. She does all that. She comes here. Would she have been happier just staying home and not converting? It's not like she was a bad person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why put yourself through that? A modern therapeutic deistic God would never ask you to make that kind of sacrifice.
Or sacrifice, period. How much is sacrifice involved in that, in therapy? Is sacrifice a point at all for someone to grow and be strengthened and progress personally? Is that a part of what you would see in the mainstream at all in therapy? You can be stronger if you face this. You can be stronger, and I can help you do that. I can, step by step, stepping into the fear a little bit or stepping into the norm or whatever it might be, right? Is that a part of it, or are we the exact opposite of that in the consensus?
I think we do both.
Okay.
The term we use in therapy for that kind of we don't call it sacrifice. We call it resilience.
Okay.
And what that means is, can you pick yourself up? Do you have the social support and the individual strength to keep going in the face of what can be really difficult things? And we work with people that have done, that are tremendously disadvantaged, that have gone through horrifying traumas, and I think we help most of them really well, and we help them find, and this is where I think there is some correspondence between therapy and religion, which is we help our clients find meaning in that suffering. We help them find purpose and then growth out of it, and we narrate that in a way that they're no longer victims, but survivors and growth, and maybe they would have rather never been through that, but they, having been through that, they have gained certain things that can now benefit them and the system they're in. So we do have that idea, but we also have this idea, if you're unhappy, we're just gonna try to soothe you too, and so particularly here, I'll take pot shots at my colleagues in psychiatry, but a lot of the medications we give, sometimes those might be necessary, but a lot of those medications are to
The short-term solution.
Yeah, they're a Band-Aid, or they mask. We've got these emotions and we don't know how to handle them, so those drugs will just smush you down here, so you don't have the highs and you don't have the lows, and it just keeps you in this narrow band where you're not really alive. Now, again, sometimes those are necessary. I'm not making any blanket prescriptions here, except I think we probably are over prescribing those. Let me take another example, if you will, Greg, which is suicide. Uh, well, it goes deeper. So mental health, I say, me and my colleagues, and I include myself in this, we made a deal with the devil when we agreed to medicalize our profession. In other words, we said, well, doctors get insurance. Counselors should get insurance payments too. We need to be paid by insurance companies.
Hmm.
And the deal we made with the devil is we said, okay, if people are coming to us and we want to get paid by insurance companies, then the people that are seeing us are diseased. So it's called the medical model or the disease model, but we're automatically pathologizing people that do that. And a lot of my colleagues, we kind of universally united in hating insurance companies, but I'm like, do you take the money? We take the money. Mm-hmm. So we're complicit in this system of pathologizing people that come to see us. And I think it does taint it. And you see that in suicide. 1999, if you look at suicide rates, they were declining until 1999. What happened in 1999? Bill Clinton had a national suicide task force, and we put it in hands of the caring, loving therapists. And that was the all-time low, and it has not been as high. It's gone up since. And all this effort and all this work we've done has actually not made the problem any better. And I think
has it directly made it worse?
It's really hard to prove, and I don't want to oversell that. I suspect, though, that here's what I think. And again, it's hard to prove. There's no proof of this. There's just correlation, and we know correlation is not causation. But I think we turned what is often an existential crisis of meaning into a sickness.
Interesting. And
you can't heal a sickness. Well, you can't heal an existential crisis by saying you're sick, because you're not sick. You need help finding meaning and purpose in your life, but you're not necessarily got some mental disorder, right? You don't have a chemical imbalance. Sometimes you do, of course.
Sure, it happens.
Very generally. But I think this is just my opinion and the opinion of some others. I can give you some sources if you want that do agree with me, but this is far from settled question. I think we really have here a crisis of meaning, or people just don't feel like they're a waste of space, or they don't matter and they're not making a difference. And I think
so. It's meaning and value. Meaning and value. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And feel like I am acting in the world in a way that is noticed and that matters and makes a difference. And you can do that. Some people do that in a negative way by joining a gang, or some of these mass murderers, they want their names in the headlines. And so the media is complicit in that. But there's all kinds of sick ways people want to feel meaningful and important. And then the people who can't even do that the sick ones, some of the sick ones will turn it on the world. I shouldn't say sick. I'm buying in the medical model.
Right.
Evil. The evil ones will turn it out in the world. And the more inward directed ones will just try to kill themselves. So that, I don't think, sometimes that is a disorder, but I think most of the time it's not. These are philosophical, religious, questions that I think therapists can help with, but sometimes maybe in pathologizing that and medicalizing that, we might be making it worse, because we say to somebody, oh, you're sick. And is that really the best thing to say? Maybe we should be saying, oh, we need to help you find your meaning and purpose in life.
I can help you understand this.
Yeah. But you see, insurance companies won't pay for that.
Yeah, well, that was what I was just going to say. Then, how much do the insurance companies affect the course of therapy?
A lot.
A lot. Yeah. Okay.
And so we're ethical about it. We find diagnoses, but
sure, of course,
we have our little Bible. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and we're in our 5th edition. And if you can fit one of those criteria, usually, there's some at the end, then the insurance company will pay for it.
Yeah.
But if they can't,
and of course, that's more and more centralized into a small committee that's going to be directing how that works, and handshaking between the insurance company and the experts in psychology and therapy, et cetera. Right.
Right.
Very centralized. Okay. So what that does is it builds more consensus.
It does. That's why we call it the Bible, not ironically, but it literally too.
Exactly. Okay. So I wanted to bring up this contrast here between your comment in your article and Natasha Helfer's comment here on shame. So you say here, the goal of therapists aligned with this point of view isn't to change these behaviors. And that would be, as you put here, behaviors that are manifesting in a pathological sense. Let's see, let me back up and make sure I've got this wrong here. Certain practices, sexual practices, and other things that some of these organizations seem to promote. You say the goal of therapists aligned with this point of view isn't to change these behaviors, which could be hurting people themselves, but rather to reduce the shame and increase acceptance, right? Both among the clients themselves and society at large, which is interesting because if that is the goal of the therapist, then Natasha Helfer was following exactly what that goal is, the dual goal there, which is both with her clients and society at large. Yeah. I'll get to that in a minute here with some other therapists that signed on with her and talking about this social advocacy. But so she's saying, look, we've got to reduce the shame. That's the primary thing, reduce the shame. Or that's what you're saying, that's what they say, right? So she goes right along with that here. She says, I was receiving a flow. She's talking about as an adolescent when in the church, growing up in the church. And so she says, I was receiving a steady flow of abstinence-based, fear-based, and shame-based sexual education. And here are some of the experiences and messages I was grappling with and feeling in constant tension with. And she has several quotes I could pull here that are about this. Another one here on teens. Our children and teens deserve a home where they are not shamed for their sexual feelings, thoughts, and actions. Right? How, again, the to me, and at least in a gospel sense, if you're removing shame completely, but feeling shame yourself, and we might have I'll think of the word here in a minute, but we might have different ideas of what shame means and what it is. But if that's the primary focus, again, it goes back to what you were saying about kind of the short-term thing where I don't need to go through anything tough, and anything that is going to be an obstacle for me, instead of me changing behavior, I need everybody else to change. I need the norms to change. Right. Because if I feel ashamed,
fit the norm,
that's what we need to get rid of. I need to Clorox my environment. The problem with that is then you're that much more susceptible all the time to shame. Right. It's like a germ, right? If I'm constantly in a purified, Cloroxed environment and I step outside for a second, I'm that much more susceptible to the germs. Isn't that right?
Right. And I make that point when I say, look, well, first of all, Natasha is not wrong again. All of our professional associations have varying ways we describe that we have an obligation to advocate for, things that promote our profession and our best practices. So she's again, not wrong that you have an ethical obligation to do that. But where I disagree with her is, and where I was alarmed and what really promoted me to write that article, is for her to say, my way is the only way, and I have to tell the church that they're wrong. And it's only now I'm only following the canons of my profession when I do that. Well, like I say, she is probably in the mainstream of at least the sex therapists. I don't know about therapists in general, but it is not congruent with traditional religion, any of them. And I think that goes back to, I really feel like my personal religious belief is I want to be aligned with the truth. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. But you used that word norms again, because what Natasha's saying is, look, some people aren't, for whatever reason, we won't judge, but they can't fit that norm, right? They're not, we have this ideal in the church. And I'll meet her halfway too, where I think we don't always talk about this in the best way. I think you pointed that out too. But where I differ from her is I don't think we need to get rid of the law of chastity. In fact, I think as a church, the law of chastity is actually one of our best features. The Me Too movement has demonstrated, and Elder Christofferson talked about this in, I think it was October conference, when he said, consent alone is not sufficient to prevent people from getting hurt, right? And we see this in Me Too. And these women are right. Oh, I was manipulated into having sex that I didn't want to have so I could get a Harvey Weinstein movie, or because my boss did this. Well, you consented, right? You were over 18 and you consented. Why are you complaining now? Well, they should complain. I agree with them that they were put in positions that was unfair and that were difficult and that caused them harm. But what can the world say there that's better than our law of chastity? They don't dare say, don't be a cad to the men, right? And they don't dare say to the woman, don't give it up so easy. You see this on campuses nowadays, where, young women will go to parties and a guy will hit on them at the party and want to have sex with them, and she'll turn them down, and she'll say, and they'll call her the B word. Mm-hmm. They'll call her an ice queen. Well, after being called a B word 12 times, you're kind of sick of it. And so maybe they just decide to give in because they're tired of getting hated on. Isn't it really better to have a norm, go back to these norms that says, don't have sex before marriage? I think so. Again, this is with my religious hat on, not my therapist hat on. But these are things that therapists can't answer, right? So back to Natasha's point, and you made this point too in your last podcast, there are ways to address shame. There are ways to talk about chastity and celibacy and being single without chucking out the law of chastity. Yeah, we could probably teach it better. We could teach it in age-appropriate ways. We can teach it less shame-based. But the principles themselves, I believe, and I say this as a therapist, and I say it as a member of the church, are true and sound, and I have a testimony of them, and I see it in my clients. Now, again, some people reacting online to my article think I just preach. We read the scriptures all day in session, and if my clients aren't interested in that, and they've got their life goals, I work with them within the parameters they want.
Sure,
but there's nothing I've seen in the therapy chair that has ever told me, oh boy, the law of chastity just doesn't work for those people. I get that they've got their agency and they want to pursue their life, and they have a right to do that. And it is not my right as a therapist to tell them they're doing it wrong. And so I don't. But at the same time, I think Natasha and I differ because she sees these people that have the hard time meeting that. And yes, some of them do have an unhealthy shame, right, about this. And I say there's ways we can work on that unhealthy shame without saying, oh, porn can be okay sometimes, or it's not that bad, or don't worry about it. There's ethical porn. Maybe we want to go into that or not, but I think it's nonsense. But there's this idea of ethical porn. So you can look at ethical porn and it can spice up your marriage. And I just don't agree. Even though, again, this is probably a mainstream belief. She's not
well
off filter there.
Right. I get that part. But why does it go one side only? Because, for example, let's say I go to a therapy session and I'm a member of the church, mm-hmm. and I believe in the law of chastity, right? What about the norm is not the law of chastity? Mm-mm. So I'm outside the norm. So why is there not an advocacy to change the other way? What about me? I mean, I'm outside of that. I'm on the fringe as far as sexual activity goes.
Well, you clearly need therapy, Greg, because you had this internalized shame from this patriarchal religion that has taught you to hate your sexuality.
So that's interesting because that's where the shame then comes in, right? It's brought in then at that point to say that what I need to do is just not worry about it, right? Just not have the shame.
Mm-hmm. Right. Instead of saying, here's the standard, let's work on, if again, this is your belief, right? So we're assuming here you are a believing Latter-day Saint with a testimony.
Good assumption.
That is your own, right? This isn't your parents. This isn't inertia. This isn't cultural. This is really, you have You believe this and you want this for yourself. Okay. So let's grant all that. Don't forget any of that, because that's all really key. And sometimes it takes a few sessions to figure out, what people's motivation is. But at that point, I would argue that I am ethically required to help you find a way. And because I have the cultural competence and the shared testimony of that, I think a believing Latter-day Saint therapist is uniquely positioned to help somebody like you if you were looking for therapy. And I would do harm if I said, well, Greg, yeah, you've got a hang up here, and the church is wrong, or the church is going to change on this, right? Oh, maybe that's what they say today, but they're going to come around. I think that makes you more fragile, and either you're going to be harmed by that therapy. And you might leave. You probably won't even tell me. You'll probably, and by the way, we can send the link in your piece, but my co-writer, a colleague at Public Square Magazine, Christopher Cunningham, wrote a piece in Public Square Magazine called it's Our Latter-day Saint Therapists Meeting Client Expectations. And this was an informal survey. This isn't any kind of peer-reviewed anything, but I still think it should be a wake-up call for us LDS therapists. Of the 70 people, he got 120 people to respond to his survey. 70 of them said they specifically sought a therapist that would affirm them in their goals of staying a church member. And they wanted therapy that would stay within the boundaries, more or less. I mean, there's some things you can maybe negotiate on the fringes. We can talk about some examples of that if you want, but basically these are the boundaries I want. Half of them said their LDS therapists did not support them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's you said that this was interesting. I want to go right to this, because you said here in one of your paragraphs in that article, you said, what too many mental health professionals don't appreciate is that religion is every bit a core identity. I think this is key. A core identity as other identities like race or sexuality can be. Different clients are going to prioritize different aspects of their identity and core beliefs. It's like, look, I'm an LDS man. I'm coming in here based on this identity, which is core to me and important to me. It's like if I'm going to go in and I'm a gay man and I'm going in to a therapist talking, and they're treating me like I'm completely heterosexual, going along the same lines with that. That doesn't work. That's not going to work. So that's crucial. Now, you said that a number of them didn't go along with, what did you say? Go along with holding up the LDS standards?
Right. These people in Christopher's survey, half of them said their LDS therapists did not support them in their goals to stay. They undermined them. And why this should be a wake-up call is they all said they didn't even tell their therapists. They just quit going. Right. So we may not even know we're doing this. Let me interject. Is the LDS therapist putting those other values up because they're basically just putting up the consensus, the Bible, as you said, whatever that was, that acronym, they're putting that up above the LDS principles of their client. I mean, as a therapist, I hear other clients sometimes say their therapist told them such and such. And I always say, if a wife says, well, my husband's therapist came back and said it's okay to do this and that, I said, call that therapist up and make an appointment with her or him and hear it from the horse's mouth, because people don't always report accurately. So I want to cut my colleagues some slack here, but that's why I say it should just be a wake-up call. But it does appear that a lot of us are not doing our job, because we all believe, this is not a controversial one, we all believe in self-determination. We all believe that we are supposed to help our clients achieve their goals. And it seems like we're undermining that. Some of us are undermining that sometimes, and we're doing harm instead of helping our clients. And that should be really sobering. And these are LDS therapists, right, Greg?
Yeah. I mean, for me or my family, that would be the number one issue, right? As far as choosing a therapist, that's going to be number one. Mm-hmm. What is that divergence just going to grow?
I think I don't know. I mean, I'm gonna talk to some colleagues and see if we can push back, but it takes a lot of effort and research, and can we even get published? Can we lay the groundwork for this counter narrative? I haven't given up, but I have to tell you, I'm not very optimistic either. I mean, it just seems like, we haven't created a new norm. We've just dissolved existing norms, right? So ASECT they talk about polyamory or consensual non-monogamy. They talk
Yeah.
about BDSM and kink. They talk
adultery.
about, what? Yeah. They talk about these things, and there's healthy ways and there's unhealthy ways to do it.
It's back to consent, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like that's the issue. That's the only issue.
Right. And it is not, in my religious opinion, it's not sufficient. But where's the new norm? The new norm is this fuzzy, well, is it healthy? This is more than your audience wants to know, but they used to change it from safe. There used to be this acronym, and it was safe, BDSM and kink. And they changed that from safe to risk aware consensual kink. It's called RACK, R-A-C-K. Don't Google it, but just trust me, risk aware consensual kink. And what it means is you might get hurt. I won't say more.
Okay, far enough. We're good.
The new rule is so long as your partner is aware of the risks,
right?
Aware consensual kink. If they're aware of the risks and it's consensual, it's okay. This is just, I can't imagine some of these things ever being okay. Again, morally speaking, from my point of view. But what's happened is we don't have a norm, even though I think empirically, a child raised by its a biological mother and father who are married and committed to each other is by far the best thing for society. And we've got about 30,000 studies that say family structure matters, and that's the best, in general, family structure. There's always exceptions, and the Family Proclamation talks about that, right? Individual adaptation. But that should be, in my opinion, the norm. But that is, see, we have a totally different idea.
Even if it's not the norm, the ideal's got to stay. I mean, that's, again, my LDS perspective on that is,
and I'm with you. And that's
why, even if it's not the norm, you've got to stick with the ideal.
We've got to. Charles Murray wrote a book a few years ago called Coming Apart. And he talks about how the elites actually live very conservative lives. They marry heterosexually. They stay married mostly. This is average. He says he wishes they would preach what they practice. Because, if Madonna has 5 husbands and 3 kids by that, her kids are probably still okay because they've got tutors, they've got all this money, they've got all this stuff. So Madonna can kind of live that way. And her kids probably be okay, even though I think they'd be better with the father, in the home consistently. But they'll probably be okay. But some poor single woman, living in an urban area, she follows Madonna's example. Her kids are going to pay the price. And they're the ones that are going to impact by the lack of these norms. So again, this isn't the therapist's job necessarily to do, but the therapists do see the effect and the fallout of this. I see the impact of people not following that standard. So what's our new norm? What is it? If we talk about it, so my big beef with ASECT is they have elevated sexual fulfillment to the be all end all. That is, and I believe I'm very pro. I think our theology's sex positive, and I think we're created as sexual beings, and there's wonderful that, but there's a kind of inversion that comes, seek ye first the kingdom of God. Well, if we seek first our sexual fulfillment, then we might not make the kingdom of God. Again, this is a religious thing, but a lot of sex therapists think this is the be all end all. I have a friend he's got same-sex attraction, and he's single, and he's planning on keeping church standards. And it really irritates him when people pat him on the head and say, "You poor boy." He's not a boy, he's an adult, but "You poor young man, you're in this oppressive church, and you're not going to be sexually fulfilled." And he says, who would presume to say that to me if I was wearing saffron robes and a shaved head and I was in Tibet? You wouldn't ever presume to
Interesting.
intrude
Yeah.
on their culture. But if suddenly it's okay for you to denigrate my life choice, that is a very spiritual and sacred thing for me.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison. Two things I wanted to finish up on here, unless you've got something else to bring up that you thought was important, is it just two questions. What should an LDS therapist be doing to parse this out, right, actively? And secondly, what does an LDS parent, especially, or individual even, need to do to make sure that they're finding the right therapist?
Great questions. First of all, personally, back to what's going to happen. I go back to what Neil Maxwell said, where we have to face Zion, even if we have to live in the world. We have to uphold Zion, and that may mean there might come a time when I can't practice my profession and be congruent with my religious beliefs. And so, do I serve Mammon in the form of the AAMFT, the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, or DOPL, the Occupational Licensing Board here in Utah? Or do I follow my religion? So far, I feel like I can do that. But if this dominant worldview wins and imposes this, I may not be able to. And I know which one I'll choose at that point. But there's a lot of my colleagues who are concerned about this, and they're afraid, and I don't blame them. So that's what LDS therapists have to ask themselves is, where do I stand? And can I, in good conscience, uphold church teachings with important caveat, with my LDS clients, right? My believing LDS clients that want to pursue that. Can I, in good conscience, encourage that? And I'm afraid too many of my colleagues, and I wonder about the ones that signed the letter, I'm worried if they can do that. And if they can't, then I don't know that they have the cultural competence to treat that population. If there's, I don't have any doubt Natasha's a good therapist. I know people that see her and they like her.
I'm sure she's done a lot of good. I don't doubt that at all.
But I would not refer somebody to her who had this faith reconciliation conflict. And maybe she's good at that too, but just based on her public comments, I don't see it. So that's where I'd say, can you really support someone that wants to do it? Because there are therapists, LDS therapists every day saying, men with same-sex attraction who are married to a woman, you'll never be happy that way. You need to experiment with sex with men and see if you like that better. Or a single man, again, who has a testimony and wants to stay true to the church. No, you should just leave the church and try that. Hang on and just do what you want and be as active as you can, but date men and be sexually active with men or women. And just hope the church changes, right? I think that sets people up for failure, because I don't think the church is going to change. But even if it does, eventually, which again, I totally disagree with, every time there's a pro-family, a pro-traditional family comment or talk or article in the Ensign, these people are shattered again. We need to help people deal with the world as it is.
That's a great point. That right there is a great point, because that's just going to bring on more shame.
Yeah, that's right. Or anger, right?
Yeah. So it almost seems like there's got to be a deeper, stronger message for that, though, than maybe we're sometimes getting. And I'm not talking about the brethren or anything. I'm just talking about as a culture.
Right. And we have screwed up ideas about marriage, about family, about our goals, and all these play into it. And I mean the larger culture here. We always beat up on LDS culture, and sometimes it deserves it. But the larger culture is even more screwed up. Its ideals about love and marriage and romance and sex are very unhealthy. Maybe we could have a whole episode where I yell about The Bachelor, right? Sure. I think that's what it teaches.
That would be all you and then me. I've never seen it, so
I haven't either.
My daughter could tell me every episode, though, I bet.
But that is messed up. That is not a way to find a good mate. So So I guess I'd say, to answer your second question, level with your therapist. First of all, don't be afraid to fire your therapist. I tell my clients that too. I don't feel loyalty to me. Feel loyalty to your growth and your healing. And even if I was the best therapist in the world, and I'm not, Natasha would probably tell you that I'm not too. But even if I were, it's not always a good fit. And that matters. That is, in fact, the most important thing. One of the things that I am confident in is the therapeutic alliance, the relationship between therapist and client is the most important aspect, more than any theory or modality or practice. That connection with your therapist is important. If you're not feeling it, if you're not getting it, or if you're not growing, or you've outgrown them, fire them. Don't feel bad about that at all. We all, I want to say this, I've criticized my colleagues, but I think I can confidently say we all want you to get better, and we won't feel bad if you feel like you can get better healing elsewhere. And so likewise, when you're hiring us, when you're doing a job interview in our first session, say just what you've said. Can you support me? These are my goals. I need a therapist to support me. Can you really do that? Do you believe in me? And do you believe in these principles enough to help me?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. You're a little more optimistic than I am on this too, but I can hope that things go well. But in terms of behavioral sciences or science as a whole, or the humanities, or anything coming out of there, it worries me, because there's so much divergence now. I don't know that it can be pulled back. I don't know that it can be brought back together. And you've got those that are in the consensus in those disciplines that are now looking across a larger chasm over to the LDS Church, for example. That chasm is not shrinking, it's growing. And so I don't know. I hope things work out, and I hope there's going to be paths where LDS therapists are going to be able to maneuver between those two and hang on to both sides of that chasm. And
I hope I can be a positive contributor to that, and so maybe we'll have more to say. Yeah. But your diagnosis is not wrong. I hope your prognosis is. So.
Okay, great. Jeff, thanks so much. Really appreciate your time, and we'll do it again.
Okay.